I was mid-sip into my morning coffee when the garden hose gave a wheeze like a dying mule. Then nothing. Dry. Not a single drop. Strange, considering I own the creek that supplies water to this entire valley. It had been a scorching 100-degree week in mid-July, and my little patch of green heaven was surviving by the grace of the spring-fed stream that curled beside my cabin. My land sat just beyond the fussy HOA known as Whispering Pines, a name better suited for a bath bomb than the maze of overly pruned lawns and curtain-twitching retirees. I'd lived there peacefully for 6 years, raising chickens, growing heirloom tomatoes, and staying out everyone's business on the land my grandfather left me. That quiet end of the day, Karen moved in, 3 doors down the ridge. Karen, the ex-realtor turned self-declared HOA queen, wore a face like she just smelled sour milk, and carried herself like the world had personally wronged her. She developed an unhealthy fixation on my land, snapping photos through the fence, phoning in bogus complaints, and once climbing a ladder to spy on my compost pile. But cutting my water line, in the middle of a drought, that was war. I followed the hose uphill, uneasy. The ground felt strange, soft, freshly dug. My gut twisted. I tracked the disturbed earth like a hound, heart pounding. My irrigation pulls from a pipe connected to a filtered inlet at the creek. It should have been untouched. Instead, the pipe was sliced clean through, held shut with a bright pink flag that read, "Violation removed per order." Order from who? I muttered, jogging toward the edge of my land where it meets the HOA boundary. I passed the old oak tree, my side's landmark, and stopped cold. There she stood, Karen, arms folded, sunglasses low on her nose, sweat glistening off her pastel sweater like she was modeling for Passive Aggression Monthly. She didn't blink when I yelled. I demanded to know what the hell she was doing. "You've been overwatering during a restricted period," she said without missing a beat. No apology, no shame, just Karen, in her full glory, rewriting the rules of nature to suit her taste for control. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As HOA president, I have a duty to act. I reminded her, again, that my land wasn't under her jurisdiction. She sniffed. "Water doesn't respect fences. You were setting a bad example." Then she turned and walked off like she just delivered a standing ovation TED Talk, leaving me knee-deep in dusty soil, beside a slice pipe, and a rage brewing hotter than the July sun. That's when it hit me. Like thunder cracking dry timber. Karen had no clue. She'd severed the one line fed by the creek. My creek, a spring that gurgled up behind my chicken coop, curved through my garden, rolled under the little wooden footbridge I built with my father, only then, trickled into Whispering Pines. From there, it fed their plastic-perfect lawns, their high-maintenance roses, and their smug little golf green. They had no well, no rain catchment, no tanks, just a fantasy land of automatic sprinklers hooked to a water source they didn't own. I crouched beside the pipe and laughed. Quietly at first, then louder. For the first time since this HOA circus began, I had leverage. Real, undeniable leverage. If they wanted a water war, well, I'd be more than happy to play general. That evening, I patched the pipe with scrap PVC and a wrap of electrical tape, just enough to get the flow back for my garden and hens. But tomorrow was for the long game. First, I pulled out my grandfather's property records, sealed in a weatherproof sleeve and tucked in my filing cabinet. They confirmed 2 critical facts. 1, my property line ended 10 feet before the HOA claimed it did. 2, I held legal deed rights to the springhead and flow path, recorded 78 years ago and reaffirmed during a 2001 county reassessment. Black and white, notarized, unshakable. The creek belonged to my land, first, last, and legally. The next day, I painted bright orange stripes on 3 old cedar posts and hammered them into the ground. I added flags, clearly marking the boundary. Anyone crossing that line would be doing it knowingly. And beside the pipe, I left a mason jar with a handwritten note. Water's a funny thing. It only flows where it's welcome. At dawn, I took a stroll downstream. Whispering Pines looked thirsty. Lawn after lawn, once fluorescent and photo shoot ready, was wilting. Sprinklers clicked dry. Garden hoses lay slack and sunburned. And there in Karen's driveway stood a knot of HOA board members, sweaty, fuming, pointing fingers. It was beautiful, because sometimes the only way to handle a drought is to let things dry out, especially entitlement. She looked up the hill and locked eyes with me. I gave her a friendly wave. That afternoon, a man in a tan uniform, a contractor with a laminated county badge, ambled onto my land. I intercepted him before he got far. He said the HOA had sent him to assess unauthorized modifications to shared infrastructure. I asked if he had a warrant. He didn't. I told him to turn around and come back with one. And he did. This wasn't just a battle. I planned to win. I was going to outmaneuver them so completely that the next time they touched a hose, they'd check twice whose water it carried. That night, I walked the creek by lantern light, the soft burble of water mixing with the distant yips of coyotes. In that darkness, the little stream shimmered with possibility. With the right tools and patience, I could tilt the entire flow into a deeper bend, one that naturally skipped their side altogether. It wouldn't be illegal. It wouldn't even be unnatural. According to the law, you can redirect water on private land, as long as you don't infringe on anyone's established downstream rights. But that was the thing. They had no rights, only assumptions. And by morning, I had a plan to turn every ounce of that assumption into sun-baked dust. The sun cracked over the ridge like an egg on cast iron. By then, I was already knee-deep in the creek, rubber boots on, grin wide. The early morning chill raced around my ankles as I examined a familiar bedrock upstream, the one I used to skip stones across as a kid. Just a few feet to the left, the stream could shift entirely. No dam, no concrete, no sabotage, just a subtle push, a natural nudge, a persuasion. If they didn't want me using my own water, then they sure as hell weren't going to use it either. I started by placing large flat stones along the edge where the water forked. Nothing that screamed intent, just a nudge. Then I added a few logs nestled tight, natural debris in just the right spots. Erosion control, I'd call it. Routine maintenance. By noon, the creek song had changed. The burble leaned softly into the bend that curled behind my orchard and away from the culvert feeding whispering pines. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. But it was happening, and I watched the HOA like a hawk. They were unraveling, but in polite suburban panic, hidden beneath brittle smiles and chirpy newsletters. That Monday's memo, titled Responsible Water Use Tips, it warned of drought conditions and asked residents to cut back on non-essential irrigation. I nearly framed it, because sometimes karma doesn't knock. It trickles. That might have worked if their entire identity hadn't been built on lush, perfect lawns and ornamental fountains that now sat bone dry. I overheard one Whispering Pines resident at the diner downtown, lamenting how her roses were shriveling and the koi pond looked more like a mud puddle. Karen hadn't spoken to me since the standoff at the pipe, but I knew she was scheming. She didn't like being ignored. She really didn't like being outsmarted. So I tightened up my game, checked my boundary markers every morning, set up a trail cam inside a hollow birdhouse. And just for fun, I posted a handmade sign right at the creek's fork. Private spring, not HOA maintained. It wasn't hostile, just a fact. But in Karen's world, facts were weapons, especially when they undermined her power. A couple days later, I spotted a stranger loitering near my east fence. Khakis, polo shirt, clipboard, pretending to admire the wildflowers. I called out, "Can I help you?" He flinched, muttered something about flow pattern documentation for a community interest group. I asked for a business card. He didn't have one. Agency name? Suddenly, he remembered another appointment. I snapped a clear photo of his license plate as he sped off down the dirt road. They were trying to build a case. Photos, reports, buzzwords, hoping to sway someone at the county. Too bad I'd beaten them to it. Weeks earlier, I'd submitted a full packet myself. GPS logs, drone footage, notarized deeds, topographical overlays, everything cataloged and time-stamped. If anyone was dancing on a legal line, it wasn't me. Meanwhile, the HOA's mask was cracking. I started hearing town gossip. One board member questioned Karen's decisions. Another reportedly stopped paying his dues. I didn't gloat, but I didn't feel bad either. They cut my water without notice. During a drought. On land they didn't own. That comes with consequences. Then came the next escalation. I woke up one morning to fresh footprints by the upstream bend. Sneakers, not boots. Someone had snuck in during the night and poked around my rock placement. Nothing moved much, but someone tried to reverse my redirection. That was the last straw. I rigged up motion-activated sprinklers near the creek, hooked them to my barn's pressurized tank. But instead of just water, I added a deterrent blend I use to keep raccoons out of my melon patch. Garlic oil and a dash of concentrated skunk scent. Totally safe, but it could peel paint off siding. That night, just after 2 a.m., the sensor tripped. The next morning, the trail cam footage revealed a familiar face. One of Karen's board members creeping along the creek edge under cover of night. Within seconds, he was blasted head to toe by the motion-activated sprinklers. He screamed, slipped in the mud, and ran off like a cartoon villain mid-heist, hollering something that got drowned out by the spray. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. I saved the footage in 3 separate locations, just in case I needed to press trespassing charges later. By now, the HOA's access to the creek had withered. What was once a gently flowing stream through whispering pines had dwindled to damp rocks and scattered puddles. Dry patches spread beneath their community-funded decorative bridge. The Greenbelt, once their pride, looked like an overcooked prairie in late August. Karen tried to hold a town hall meeting about environmental sabotage, but things quickly turned sideways. Residents started asking uncomfortable questions about the HOA's water management. One woman flat out asked if Karen had legal authority to dig on adjacent land. Karen flushed crimson and danced around the answer like a politician dodging subpoenas. I watched the whole scene like a front-row spectator at a slow-burning play. I had lemonade in one hand and a manila folder of legal records in the other, ready to go should the county need another friendly reminder. But I didn't send it. Not yet. Power didn't lie in yelling. It lived in pressure, quiet, growing undeniable. Let them flail while I stayed still. Let them chase control until they realized they never had it. One golden evening, just before the sun dipped below the ridge, I stood at the edge of my orchard. The newly diverted creek shimmered through rows of peach trees. Birds fluttered at the banks. A pair of deer emerged, cautious but curious, and drank from the stream. I felt something close to peace, not because I'd won, not officially, but because I reclaimed something sacred without yelling, suing, or slinging fists. I had simply outsmarted them. And in a drought-driven standoff, there's no satisfaction quite like watching the opposition wilt while your roots thrive. The heat worsened. It pressed down on the valley like a smothering quilt. Even the flies buzzed slower. In whispering pines, those pristine lawns, once emerald trophies, curled into beige, brittle patches. Every blade of grass looked like it gave up. The HOA newsletter changed its tune. No more sunny, water-saving tips. Now it read like a disaster response memo, calling for drought task forces and emergency water truck funding. That was rich, considering they still hadn't admitted where their water once came from. But I wasn't worried about their spin. I was worried about muddy boot prints. Again, along the creek. This time, they were deeper into my property, close to the new bend, just feet from my camouflage trail cam. The footage showed Karen herself, flanked by a man in work boots and a tool belt, probably a plumber or contractor. They stood near the new fork in the creek, pointing, crouching, whispering. No damage yet, but the intention was clear. It was only a matter of time before she tried something bold, and she did. 2 days later, I caught the same contractor elbow deep in my creek, wrench in hand, trying to redirect the water back toward the HOA culvert like it belonged to them. He hadn't even knocked or called, just waited in like he owned the place. I approached calmly, phone already recording. "Can I help you?" I asked. He muttered something about redirection for environmental flow regulation. "Who hired you?" I asked. He paused. "Then the HOA got a permit?" He didn't. Then you've got 30 seconds to pack up your tools and get off my land before I call the sheriff. He left in a hurry, trudging through the mud, dragging a wrench in one hand and what was left of his pride in the other. I posted the video to the community Facebook group with the caption, "Just trying to protect my tomatoes." Within hours, it spread like a grass fire in July. People who normally steered clear of HOA drama suddenly found their voices. That's Jack's land. They've got no right. Karen's finally gone too far. It was a small town, and when the gossip's good, it moves faster than wildfire. By morning, 2 sheriff cruisers were parked outside the Whispering Pines Community Center. That made me smile. Later that afternoon, a deputy truck pulled up my drive. It was Sheriff Mills himself. Good man. Thick mustache, boots that had survived 20 winters, and probably a few marriages. He stepped out and gave me that tired nod that said, "This town's losing its damn mind." He asked if I had more footage. I showed him the whole thing. The contractor, the trespass, the boundary markers, the maps. He nodded, asked for copies, said he'd have a word with the HOA. When I asked if Karen could be charged, he sighed. "Probably not yet," he said. One more step out of line, and she'll be buying herself a fine the size of a used truck. Still, I knew better than to expect peace. Karen was like a raccoon in a trash can. Shove her out at night. She's back by dawn. So I leveled up my defenses. 2 new trail cams, smaller, deeper, smarter. I hung old CDs from fishing line to reflect light near the creek, not for surveillance, but for mischief. Let them wonder if they were being watched by a scarecrow with laser eyes. The masterpiece, though, was my retool motion sprinkler. I rigged a tank I'd once used for organic crop spray and filled it with a safe but infernal cocktail: garlic extract, fish emulsion, and peppermint oil. Harmless, sure, but it smelled like a compost heap left in the sun during a skunk convention. I aimed it right at the footpath I figured they'd use next. Sure enough, 3 nights later, bam, the system fired. I reviewed the footage and nearly dropped my coffee. Karen's golden boy, the board member in the boat shoes who always acted like HOA royalty, walked straight into the blast. 1 step, 2, then a high-pitched yelp, arms flailing, slipping like a cartoon villain down the embankment and landing in the muck with a splash. I didn't even have to post that one. By the time the sun rose, the whole town was talking. When I stopped by the general store the next day, people offered to buy me coffee just to hear the story again. I felt like a local legend, and I hadn't even left my yard. But Karen couldn't leave well enough alone. The HOA filed a formal complaint to the county, accusing me of interfering with community utilities. They threw in phrases like environmental disruption and unauthorized water hoarding. I answered with a packet: survey maps, deed history, water rights, timestamped drone footage, copies of every document I'd shown Sheriff Mills. I mailed one set to the HOA and hand-delivered the original to the county office. The clerk, bless her heart, laughed as she filed it. "You might want to frame this," she said, "because something tells me this isn't over." She was right, but neither was I. The kicker came when Karen called an emergency HOA board meeting at the clubhouse, and only 3 people showed up. One of them resigned on the spot, muttering something about being the punchline of every joke at the diner. Another came armed with copies of the Facebook video and asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, why the HOA president was hiring unlicensed contractors to trespass and tamper with private plumbing. Karen tried to shift the blame, but her authority was sinking faster than a lawn chair in quicksand. The whispering started that night. By morning, it was a roar. Just to twist the knife a little deeper, I hired a professional land surveyor, not the local guy, but a firm from 2 counties over. They brought drones, historical overlays, and satellite imagery. I wanted this documented so thoroughly it could be entered into evidence in the next century. They spent 3 days walking the property, analyzing soil, reviewing decades of hydrological flow. When they were done, they handed me a glossy, spiral-bound report that was more airtight than a seal vault. It showed the spring's origin clearly on my land, the seasonal shift in flow, and the legitimacy of my natural redirection as routine land maintenance within private boundaries. I took it to the print shop and had a laminated version made, big, bold, and weatherproof. Then I posted on a stand at the edge of the creek, right where the HOA's walking trail used to dip down for scenic photos. Below it, I added a second sign. No unauthorized water access beyond this point. Violators will be recorded, reported, and possibly sprayed. That Sunday, Karen finally showed herself again. She marched right up to the edge of my property in broad daylight, standing tall like we were about to exchange holiday recipes. She called out in her best neighborly voice that we needed to have a civil discussion. I told her I had been civil every step of the way, and that if she wanted conversation, it should have come before she sent strangers onto my land with wrenches and excuses. She huffed, then tossed out something about cooperation and hinted at a possible water-sharing agreement. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes either. I simply said, "We'll talk when you rebuilt the trust you shattered. Until then, the creek flows where the land says it should." As she turned to leave, I noticed something different. Her perfect hairstyle, usually stiff enough to survive a tornado, had begun to frizz under the heat. Her stride, once sharp and commanding, was slower. Shoulders sagged. For the first time, Karen looked less like the queen of a cul-de-sac and more like someone in over her head. And I was just getting started. When the county clerk finally processed all my paperwork, it came in a tidy envelope sealed in gold. Inside was a letter that made my whole porch feel like victory ground. It stated unequivocally that my property was not, and had never been, under the jurisdiction of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. More importantly, it affirmed that the spring head sat entirely within my legal boundaries and that all rights to the water flowing through it belonged solely to me. Full autonomy, no shared responsibility, no required disclosures. Just clean, clear authority. The HOA could keep their drought response teams and newsletters full of recycled guilt. I had the creek. I had the truth. And now, finally, I had the last word. I made 6 copies of that letter. 1 stayed in my file cabinet. The other 5 were posted like tombstones marking the death of their argument. 1 on the trail gate, 1 on the barn door, 1 on my front porch, 1 mailed to the county sheriff, and 1 taped to the HOA clubhouse bulletin board with a sticky note that read, "For educational purposes." Within 24 hours, the Whispering Pines group chat was on fire. Someone leaked a screenshot of Karen trying to downplay the ruling, claiming it was temporary or subject to review. That lie didn't last long. A second letter from the Water District surfaced, confirming what they all feared. The HOA's sprinkler system's koi pond and those precious ornamental fountains had been drawing from the creek illegally, without any formal water-sharing agreement. The creek, they now realized, was a gift, one they had misused, one they no longer had. Karen went into damage control mode. She called a special HOA board meeting to vote on establishing a legal fund to sue me for resource interference. Only 7 members showed up, voted against the motion. One even stood up and said, "Maybe we should just apologize to the guy." Karen looked like she'd been slapped with a wet sponge. Red-faced, lip-tight, she adjourned the meeting like a collapsing tent giving up in the wind. That evening, I received an anonymous email from one of the no voters. Thanks for standing up to her. Sorry it had to come to this. But what finally broke everything wide open wasn't the letters or the footage or the legal filings. It was the grass. The lawns of Whispering Pines had officially crossed from dry to dead. Cracked brown soil, crispy blades that crunched underfoot, flower beds reduced to brittle stems and regret. One woman, desperate to host an anniversary party, tried painting her lawn green. The paint turned to sludge and stained her heels. Kids stopped playing outside. Too dusty. Joggers abandoned the HOA trails, now tumbleweed corridors. Residents had reached their breaking point. And because Karen had spent months blaming me, they demanded she prove I was in the wrong. She promised she would. She filed a formal complaint with the Environmental Review Board. It was rejected within the week. No standing, no jurisdiction, no authority, no case. Then, finally, she reached out. Not in person this time. A registered letter, written in the kind of flowery, desperate language people use when trying to repackage defeat as diplomacy. She wanted to discuss a potential water usage agreement between my land and the HOA. Goodwill, mutual cooperation, shared vision, all that nonsense. I didn't respond. Not because I wasn't willing to talk, but because I knew what she really wanted. She wasn't after peace. She was after control, a seat back at the table where she thought she belonged. But we weren't equals. She'd use a position to sabotage my property, slander my name, and send unlicensed strangers into my creek with wrenches and bad intentions. She wanted her power back, but I wasn't giving it. A week later, the HOA tried a new angle, hired an independent landscaping consultant to help reimagine the community aesthetic. That backfired gloriously. The report came in blunt and unforgiving. Remove all grass, ornamental plants, and non-native shrubs. Replace with drought-resistant xeriscaping. Current design is unsustainable and borderline negligent given regional water scarcity. In short, rip it all up and start over. Karen tried to spin it as a forward-thinking green transition plan, but no one bought it, especially not after they had seen my property. Vibrant, well-watered, full of native trees, a garden that produced more tomatoes than I could eat, and animals drinking fresh creek water under the shade of fruit trees. Then the unexpected happened. A local news station picked up the story. Someone must have tipped them off. Probably one of the HOA residents tired of the drama. They sent a reporter out to my property with a camera crew. They asked to film a short segment on rural water rights and responsible land use. I said yes, but only if they promised to show the full story, not just a headline. They agreed. I walked them through the creek's origin point, the original deed, the documentation, and the before and after results of the HOA's interference. I even showed them the signs, the new irrigation system I built with underground pipes, and a before-drought photo of Karen's perfect lawn, now reduced to brittle mulch. The segment aired 2 nights later. It wasn't explosive, but it was clear, calm, factual, and it made Karen look like the exact kind of person she hated being seen as, a control freak who overstepped her bounds and ended up destroying the very thing she was trying to micromanage. The comments on the station's Facebook post were brutal. One said, "This is why you never mess with farmers." Another said, "Karen needs to sit down and touch some real grass if she can find any." After that, the HOA board held an emergency vote. Karen was removed as president by a narrow margin. She wasn't kicked out, but her power was gone. The new acting president was a retired teacher named Mr. Holloway, who I'd met once at a county fair. He sent me a handwritten letter saying he hoped we could move forward with mutual respect and no further incident. I replied with a short note thanking him and included a laminated copy of the county ruling, just so we were clear. That was when I decided to finish the reroute of the creek completely. I'd only partially diverted it before to make a point, but now I spent 3 full days digging a proper channel to rented backhoe and reinforcing it with stone, just enough to ensure it would permanently favor the new path, one that looped through my orchard, across a low spillway, and into a naturally formed marsh away from the HOA boundary. The water still flowed, but now it nurtured only my land and the animals that lived around it. No more free rides for HOA sprinklers, no more shared resource assumptions. The land provided what it wanted to those who respected it. When the job was done, I stood by the creek and watched it flow through the trees, like it had always belonged there. In a way, it had. This wasn't revenge. This was balance restored, not by force, but by boundaries and truth and a little stubbornness. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I caught sight of a lone figure standing on the far edge of whispering pines, arms crossed. Karen, watching silently, but this time she didn't say a word. It had been 3 weeks since the creek was fully rerouted, and the land had never looked better. The new path curved around the back end of my orchard, where rows of peach trees leaned into morning sun, and bees hummed lazily around the wildflowers I planted near the edge. The water flowed steady and clear, pooling naturally into a shallow basin I reinforced with smooth stones to create a kind of mini sanctuary for birds, deer, and whatever else wandered down for a drink. Every morning, I sipped coffee and watched the creek shimmer through the leaves. It felt earned, not just because I protected what was mine, but because I rebuilt it to thrive. The land had always taken care of me. I just returned the favor. With the immediate threat from the HOA gone and Karen officially sidelined, I turned my attention to finishing the project I had started a month ago but never completed, an underground irrigation network that pulled directly from a creek and fed a slow drip system throughout the orchard and garden bed. I had sketched it on graph paper last winter while snow coated the ridge, and now, with the right tools and a little sweat, it came to life. It wasn't just about watering crops. It was about resilience, about making sure I never had to depend on anyone who didn't understand the land they lived on. I rented a trench digger, laid piping with gravity-fed filters, and connected it all to a solar-powered timing system I mounted on the side of the barn. Every drop of water now moved with intention, feeding the soil without waste. The effect was immediate. Tomatoes plumped up, squash vines exploded with blossoms, and even the usually stubborn fig tree at the back of property looked less grumpy. I gave away extra vegetables at the weekend market, and folks kept asking how my garden stayed so lush when there's a giving up. I didn't say much, just smiled and said the soil knows who cares for it. Meanwhile, the HOA tried to recover from a mess. They'd started a new landscaping committee under Mr. Holloway's leadership and announced plans to convert the community areas into xeriscaping zones with native, drought-tolerant plants. It was a smart move, but a hard sell. Some residents grumbled about losing their lawns and flower beds, but with water bills climbing and public pressure mounting, they didn't have much choice. The days of weekly watering and artificial turf showrooms were gone. In their place came gravel walkways, sagebrush, and blue grama grass. It actually looked better than before, but Karen refused to acknowledge it. I learned from one of the HOA members at the feed store that Karen had retreated into her home and only came out for short walks, always alone, always avoiding the trail that used to run near the creek. It was strange to think of her as quiet. For months, she'd ruled that neighborhood with the authority of a dictator and the subtlety of a marching band. Now, she was a shadow, no apologies, no letters, just silence. But maybe that was for the best. Some people never learn through confrontation. They only learn through consequence. One morning, I was repairing a fence post near the lower pasture when a car pulled up to the edge of my drive. I didn't recognize it, but the man who stepped out was familiar. Tall, balding, a bit sunburned. He introduced himself as a journalist with a regional magazine that covered rural development, agriculture, and land rights. He said he'd seen the local news segment and wanted to do a feature. Normally, I would have said no. I didn't like the idea of putting my business on display. But this time, I thought about the bigger picture, about the number of small landowners like me who dealt with the same issues, about how few people actually understood their rights, or what could happen when those rights were ignored by people in power. So I agreed. I walked him through the property, explained the creek's natural path, showed the maps and documents, and talked about what happened in as straightforward a way as I could. He asked thoughtful questions, not about the drama, but about the land, how it had changed, what it meant to live beside a water source, and how I felt when it was threatened. It wasn't about revenge or HOA politics. It was about stewardship. When he left, he shook my hand and said, this story was one more folks needed to hear. I hoped he was right. A few days later, a brown envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a copy of the magazine, already in print. The article spanned 4 pages and included photos of the orchard, the rerouted creek, and the little wooden sign I had carved that read flow with respect. The writing was honest and generous. It didn't paint me as a hero or the HOA as villains. It told the truth plainly and let the reader decide. I appreciated that. Later that week, I got another letter, this one from a new HOA president, a formal one signed and stamped. It expressed gratitude for my patience during the conflict and requested permission to invite a group of Whispering Pines residents on a guided walk near the creek to learn more about sustainable landscaping and water conservation. They offered to stay on the public trail, not out of spite, and not enter private boundaries. Because some lines, once crossed, it was polite, respectful, changed the path forever. A far cry from demands and threats that had come before. It was small and quiet. I read it twice before deciding. A few curious retirees, some younger couples, a teenager with a sketchbook. I walked them along the new trail, pointed out the native plants, the way the soil held water better near the trees, and the importance of working with the land, not against it. They listened, they asked questions, some took notes. One woman even teared up a little when I explained how the creek had supported my family for generations. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that felt like healing. As they left, one man lingered behind and looked out across the creek. He said, "We used to think we owned this place. Now I see we're just borrowing it." I nodded and said, "The land keeps the books. It remembers everything, good and bad." That night, as the sky turned gold and the wind carried the scent of fresh soil and blooming clover, I sat on the porch with a cold drink and watched the creek wind its way past the orchard, soft and steady. For the first time in months, everything was quiet. No footsteps, no shouting, no board meetings, just the sound of flowing water and the deep, settled calm that only comes after storm has finally passed. The days grew shorter, and the ridge softened into autumn. The creek now curved gently past my orchard, its flow calmer than before, like the land itself had finally settled after months of tension. The leaves had turned gold and rust, and the once dry fields now pulsed with life again. Birds returned to nest in the hedges, and squirrels danced along the fences with acorns in their mouths. Everything had come back to balance, not because of force or fury, but because I had protected what was mine and let nature do the rest. I never set out to fight a war. I just wanted peace. But sometimes, peace has to be earned. One cool morning, I stood beside the creek with my old dog, Ranger, by my side. He was getting slower, white showing around his muzzle, but he still followed me everywhere. We watched the water flow through the rock channel I had reinforced weeks earlier. It sparkled under the rising sun, cutting a silver path across the orchard's edge. Ranger dipped a paw in and sniffed the air. I leaned on the shovel I was holding and took a deep breath. The smell of wet earth and apples filled my lungs. It reminded me of my father. He used to say, "You can't stop water. You can only guide it." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. Now I did. Across the valley, whispering pines looked different too. Gone were the emerald lawns and fancy hedges. In their place were stone gardens, native grass patches, and shaded sitting areas built from reclaimed wood. It wasn't the showy neighborhood it once tried to be, but it looked honest now, real. A few of the homes even had rain catchers and gray water systems installed. Word around town was that the new HOA president had convinced the board to fund sustainable upgrades using leftover legal funds that had been reserved for fighting me. The irony didn't escape me. The very struggle they waged against my independence had forced them to learn how to stand on their own. I received another letter that week, this time handwritten, and folded neatly inside an envelope marked only with my name. The return address was blank, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Karen. The letter was brief. She apologized not in sweeping terms or poetic language, but in a way that felt raw and uncomfortable. She said she had misunderstood the boundaries, both legal and personal, that she let her title blind her the truth, that she acted out of fear of losing control and ended up losing something more important. She ended the letter by saying she had stepped down from the board entirely and would be moving away in the coming months to stay with her sister in another state. She wished me peace and signed her name with a shaky hand, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the back of my old ledger book where I kept notes about the land. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. Some wounds do not need words to close. They just need time and distance. With the seasons shifting, I prepared the land for winter. I mulched the beds, stored the tools, and finished reinforcing the edge of the creek with native stones I had collected over the years. I even added a small wooden bench near the widest bend where the water pulled deepest. I carved a phrase into the backrest, let it flow its own way. That spot became my thinking place. Some evenings I'd sit there and listen to the owls call out across the orchard or watch the stars come up one by one above the treetops. The silence was full, not empty, a silence earned through struggle and made sweeter by the resolution. Ranger took to lying near the bench, his head resting on his paws while the wind carried the scent of pine and distant smoke from someone's wood stove. He didn't move much anymore, but he still barked at the mail truck like it was a bear, and that small sound reminded me that life, no matter how much it changes, always holds on to little pieces of its old self. One afternoon, I got a knock on the door from Mr. Holloway. He wore a clean flannel shirt and held a small basket of homemade preserves. He said it was a thank you from the HOA for the orchard tour. He stayed on the porch and didn't ask to come in, just stood there like a man who respected boundaries. He told me the board had voted to install a plaque in the community center with a quote from the article written about me. Respect the land and it will take care of you. He asked if I was okay with that. I told him I didn't need credit, but I appreciated the gesture. Then he handed me a final envelope, this one with an official seal. Inside was a formal statement from the HOA acknowledging the overreach, apologizing for the pipe incident, and confirming the permanent cessation of any claims regarding the creek. I read it and nodded and offered him a jar of my pickled green beans. He grinned and took it like it was gold. That evening, I lit a small fire in the pit out back, roasted a couple of ears of corn, and sat in the glow with Ranger snoring softly beside me. I thought about everything that had happened. The trespassing, the fake violations, the meetings, the threats, and how close it all came becoming something uglier. But instead, it ended with a letter, a bench, and the sound of a creek that flowed exactly where it was supposed to. Somewhere beyond the ridge, I heard coyotes howl in the distance. The stars blinked alive one by one above the orchard. And as I leaned back in my chair and felt the night settling around me, I realized I wasn't just watching the water anymore. I was part of it, of the land, of the balance it demanded, of the quiet strength it gave back when you listened. The fight was over. The lesson had been learned, and the flow would never be taken for granted again.